Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I want to welcome you to our first video in a 6-part series on the American Civil War titled A Country Dividing. Now the guiding question that I would like for you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, why did new states joining the Union create debate and hostility between the North and South of the United States? So first let's talk about the United States in 1819, because at this point there were 11 states that allowed slavery in the country and 11 states that did not. The northern states were the free states that did not allow slavery, while southern states were the ones that allowed slavery. And this created a lot of tension between slave and free states because obviously each had a very different way of life. And this caused each part of the country to feel especially loyal to only their region. And this is a feeling called sectionalism. And what this means is that the northern states were only trusting of northern states. They were only loyal to the northern half of the country. And the same went for southern states. They did not feel loyal to the country as a whole, but more only towards their own region and fellow slaveholding states. Because of this, both Northerners and Southerners were hoping that their way of life would spread into the new territories that were being settled in the West. This means that Northerners were hoping that slavery would be banned in new territories that were settling in the West, while Southerners were hoping that the allowance of slavery would move into these new territories. And a lot of this came from the hope that their way of life and their section of the country would become the more powerful one. So, for example, if new Western territories did not allow slavery, this would really worry the South because they would feel that their way of life and their livelihood would be threatened. And so we have our first key term of the video, and that term is sectionalism, which is defined as an exaggerated loyalty to a particular region or section of the country. Now, an igniting issue that occurred around this time period was that Missouri applied for statehood. And this happened in 1819, and it was important because Missouri was a slave state. And this created a great debate amongst the Senate and amongst the country as a whole, because adding one slave state would throw off the balance between free and slave states. And obviously this greatly worried people from free states because they feared that with more slaveholding states than free states, there would be more slave supporters who were in the Senate, which would make it much more likely that the bills passed and the laws focused upon by the government would be only those that supported slave states, and that any bills that supported free states more than slave states would not be passed. And so what happened was, after there was a great debate, the Speaker of the House, a man named Henry Clay, created a bill that was called the Missouri Compromise. And what the Missouri Compromise did is it did admit slave state Missouri into the Union, but at the same time, it also admitted free state Maine, which would keep the country's balance because now there were 12 free states and 12 slave states. The bill would also draw a line across the country at a specific parallel and said that any future territories that were north of this line would automatically be free states, while any territories that were settled south of this line would automatically be slave states. And the hope was that this was the final ruling on slavery and that going forward there would be no more drama because there was a clearly defined boundary between which areas could allow slavery and which could not. So if we look at the map, you can see the divide of the country. The northern states in blue are the free states, including Maine, and then the more southern states are the slave states colored in red, including the brand new state of Missouri. And you can see right there in yellow the Missouri Compromise line, which said that Any states that were south of that yellow line would be slave states, and any territories north of that line would not allow slavery. Now, unfortunately, this debate did not go away. The balance between slave and free states would continue until 1850, so for about 30 years. But then in 1850, California applied to join the Union. And California, it was looking like, would not allow slavery, and 3 additional territories that many believed were going to apply for statehood as well, New Mexico, Oregon, and Utah, also appeared as though they were going to join the country as free states. And this made Southerners very, very nervous, because with 4 new free states and no additional slave states, they would be greatly outnumbered in the Senate and in the government overall. And this led some Southerners to begin to talk of seceding from the United States. This brings us to our second key term of the video, which is to secede. And secede is defined as to withdraw from membership. Now, in this case, we're talking about Southern states who were talking about leaving or withdrawing from the United States in order to form a separate country. And the reason they were looking to do this is because they wanted to protect their way of life. They wanted to protect their ability to own slaves. Now, the debate around California joining the Union led to a series of bills that were called together the Compromise of 1850. And again, this was another compromise that looked to keep the balance between slave and free states. So under this compromise, California was admitted to the Union as a free state. New Mexico would join the Union as a slave state. And the third item in this compromise was one that would actually cause even much more tension, and that was that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed. And what the Fugitive Slave Act was, is it required citizens to help catch runaway or fugitive slaves. And this was wanted by the South because Southerners hoped that this would force people in the North to recognize the rights of slaveholders. You know, it would basically force Northerners to help keep slaves in slavery. And what it really did was anger Northerners more than anything, because this helped them realize slavery as being even more evil than before, because it was, you know, a way of forcing slaves who had ran away, who had maybe made it to a free state, catching them and putting them right back into slavery. So this caused another great amount of tension. A final debate on slavery would come about in 1854, when both Kansas and Nebraska were admitted to the Union. And under the prior law of the Missouri Compromise, both of these states were north of that line that would allow slavery. So again, Southerners were afraid with 2 more free states, they would be greatly outnumbered, that they would start to have their rights taken away. And so in an attempt to keep the balance, Congress passed what was called the KansasNebraska Act. And this act would actually allow the citizens in both Kansas and Nebraska to vote on whether or not to allow slavery. So this was going completely away from the former dividing line. It was now up to the citizens to vote on whether or not their territory would have slavery. So if you look here at the map, again, we have the green line there is the one drawn by the Missouri Compromise. You can see Kansas and Nebraska there, both clearly above the line. And again, just a obvious abandonment of their earlier laws to try and keep the balance within the country. Now, what would happen after this law was passed is that when voting opened in Kansas, thousands of slavery supporters from Missouri would cross over into Kansas simply to vote for slavery. And it's important to note that while there were only 1,500 people who lived in Kansas at the time of the vote, there were over 6,000 votes cast. So clearly, over 4,500 people, or 3 times the amount of people who actually lived in Kansas, had simply gone over the border in order to vote for slavery. And so this led to the vote on slavery being passed, and this really outraged the people of Kansas who had opposed slavery. And what eventually would happen is that although the pro-slavery government was officially elected, anti-slavery groups would create their own governments, and then this just led to a number of violent outbreaks between citizens who either did or did not support slavery. And this brings us to our third key term of the video. This key term is Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas is a term that is used to describe the outbreaks of violence between the pro and anti-slavery groups in Kansas. A couple of examples are that the anti-slavery capital of Lawrence was burned by pro-slavery supporters, while several other slavery supporters were killed in separate attacks. And this just, again, created a terrible amount of violence and a terrible amount of drama for the people of this brand new state and really across the country. So that brings us to the end of our first video. I have returned to your guiding question, which was, why did new states joining the Union create debate and hostility between the North and South? If you still feel as though you don't completely have a strong answer, you can go back and watch again, and we'll have the opportunity to discuss it in class. I'll be back soon with the second video in our series on the Civil War. And until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.